It used to be hard to find the exact auto parts you needed, and that meant spending a lot of time at swap meets. It's a different game now when you can order exactly what you need from eBay Motors. They have 122 million parts, so you can always find the right fitment. Spend less time searching and more time building with the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. This is Elmo and I'm with my awesome friend Daniel. Hey man, can you introduce yourself?
Hi Elmo, how are you? Thank you for having me on. My name's Daniel Vecchio. Let's see, give a little bit of my background. I'm from Concord, Massachusetts, which is the home of the Revolutionary War, where it began. The shot heard around the world, as it were, and some of the great philosophers, Emerson, Thoreau, American philosophers anyways, whether you count them as great in the history of philosophy maybe is another question, but they're great American philosophers. And I went to Assumption College for my bachelor's in philosophy, which is a Catholic liberal arts college in Worcester, Massachusetts. Went to Boston College and received my master's in philosophy and studied a bit of, the sort of the continental tradition there, a little bit of the history of philosophy, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I met my future wife there. She was in the philosophy program with me, and so we fell in love and got married in 2009, and then lived in Colorado for a little while before I entered the PhD program at Marquette University, where I did my dissertation with Dr. Owen Golden on Aristotle's modal syllogistics, which are the arguments Aristotle constructs around possibility and necessity. And I tried to resolve, I think I succeeded. I shouldn't say tried. I think I succeeded in resolving some apparent contradictions in the system by looking closely at some of the metaphysics that was underlying some of Aristotle's claims, especially as it pertains to negation. So I have two children. I have a daughter, Vivian, and a son, Bruno, and they keep me busy. And right now I live in Southern California, where my wife is from, and teach at a local community college. So that's some of my background. I'm Catholic and practicing Catholic, and I enjoy the philosophy of religion as one of my primary areas of research.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, and I noticed a bit of a background behind you, like a green screen. Do you do some YouTube channels?
Oh, I don't do a YouTube channel. I have some pictures. That's from teaching online because of the pandemic. All of our teaching has moved online. So I've been using Zoom a lot for that. And rather than exposing the world to my messy room, I usually put up a background, and that's why you might have seen some of that. But I don't have a YouTube channel per se. I've thought about starting one, but right now, if people are interested in looking at some of my work and arguments, I have a blog called Vexing Questions, which is kind of based on my high school nickname. My friends called me Vex for Vecchio, short for Vecchio. And then I thought it would be funny to put Vexing Questions together, which the initials of VQ sounds like Vecchio. Anyways, that was kind of silly, but that's where I mainly blog, and I put up arguments, a lot of ontological arguments for God's existence, things of that nature. So that's Vexing Questions, WordPress.
But how did you become a Catholic? Were you raised a Catholic and just stuck with it for the rest of your life?
Yeah. So I'm a cradle Catholic, as they call them, right? I was baptized as an infant and raised in the faith. My parents, my mother has passed away, but she was a very religious woman. And my father is a faithful Catholic, though his faith is more private. I think he was always more quiet about it growing up, but he's always practiced the faith. But my mother was the one who really, I think, imparted a spirituality in my life. So I could talk a little bit about that. My mother's background, I think that might be relevant. She, when she was young, she always had sort of a spiritual side to her. And that was kind of perverted into dabbling into the occult. She was attracted to witchcraft and contacting spirits, and so she always had a very sort of a fascination with that sort of stuff. And she had some negative experiences, which ultimately culminated for her when I was around the third grade. So I forget how old that would make me, like 8 or something. I don't know. She had a deep conversion, although she was Catholic, where she repented of this sort of dabbling in the occult and became part of the charismatic community in the Catholic Church. Are you familiar with that, Elmo? So still very much spiritually active, right? She was praying in tongues, and she would go to healing masses where she would rest in the Spirit, and take me to these too. I'm very familiar with the charismatic movement. And it's very affective in the sense that, you feel so much in the worship, and it's very intense. I mean, we would go to 6-hour masses on a Wednesday night, and I would go to school the next day exhausted. But that's sort of how I grew up with my mom in the charismatic movement in the Catholic Church. Now that movement itself is very ecumenical. And so she would often go to Protestant or evangelical services that were sort of Pentecostal or charismatic in nature. And she was very much interested in all sorts of different Christian theology that she would study. And that kind of took her a little bit away from what I would call Orthodox Catholic teaching. And I think in reaction to that, and some of what I thought were the more dangerous elements of the charismatic movement, I didn't walk away. I don't condemn it. It's just, you need a very careful spirit of discernment, because a lot of people claim to be prophets, to speak for God and say things, and people can become kind of deceived by that. And I think it's a little dangerous myself to, it's sort of like a moth to the flame, to invite so much of God in your life. It's very powerful, but at the same time, I think I needed to filter it a little through going back into the tradition, trying to engage my intellect more than just my emotions, so that I could be a little skeptical of claims and start to think through my faith and why I believe what I believe, instead of just feeling it. And I found that my spirituality was so tied to my emotions that if I didn't emotionally feel, then I felt somehow I had lost my faith or something like that. So I sort of went back and I sort of grounded myself in philosophy. I'll talk a little bit about that journey too, if you want. But that meant, I saw my mom kind of move away from Orthodox Catholic teaching into a sort of different form of Christianity. And then towards the end of her life, I think she came back to the faith. So I was pleased with that. But it was kind of a journey for her, and that journey, I think, has been passed down to me and my family as we're trying to understand our faith and think through what we believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in this sense, though, it sort of help you really ground yourself in something that rational, that's just not based on emotions. Like how you would describe your mother went through, right? And that's why you focus on philosophy a lot.
Yeah. So I'll give you a sort of a little bit about that too. So my sister, she fell in love with a man who was an atheist, and this was in college. She brought him to home to dinner one night, and we met him. And I remember he challenged my faith, and that was really the first time I had even really thought about it. And he was bringing up Nietzsche and all these different philosophers that I had never heard of, and logic. And he told me, so I remember he said something like, if you studied logic, you would understand there is no God. And so I remember the next day I went to my high school library and I took out a logic textbook because I didn't know anything about logic. And I started reading through it to see, like, well, where does it say there's no God? I thought there was like a section of my logic textbook that would explain that to me or something. And I remember reading through the whole thing and trying to figure it out, without any help. And, I couldn't make much heads or tails of it. But I realized I needed to kind of study philosophy to get a better handle on my reasons. And when I went to college, I actually wanted to study theology. And I took philosophy because it was one of the core requirements, but I didn't really know what I was getting into. So what I found in my theology class was that it was very much like a critical take on scripture and trying to sort of naturalize the scriptures. And that wasn't really what I was expecting when I wanted to study theology. I really wanted to understand God and understand God's nature. And I wanted to understand, like, why we exist. And then when I took the philosophy course, I realized, oh, wow, this is actually addressing the questions that I really wanted addressed. And so I just kept enrolling into philosophy courses until it had to be my major.
And what's awesome is you really got a master's degree on philosophy, right? And maybe you could talk about your philosophical journey and what is the foundations of your belief and why it led you to say that, oh, it is actually the religion of my birth that's right. It's Catholicism that's really the thing.
Well, that's a huge question. So again, I go back to my first intro to philosophy course, and I feel like I've been robbed of a whole past that I did not know about, right? So it was in that class that I first studied Aquinas and Anselm and some of these great proofs for God's existence, a tradition that I was completely ignorant of. And I was just blown away. I remember just sitting there like, wait a minute, you can actually think about these principles and whether they entail God's existence. And I was just shocked. And I guess I caught the fever ever since. And I've just been obsessed with thinking about these arguments. And that drove me, I think, to take more courses. I wanted to specialize in the philosophy of religion, but I ended up expanding it out a little more broadly to modal logic and metaphysics, because I think frankly, it's just a little bit more marketable. But I do enjoy Aristotle and modal logic and all that sort of stuff. So that's where I eventually went. But it was all grounded back in the sort of contemplation of God.
Yeah, so how would you answer, like, why do you believe in God?
Okay. Well, it's layered, right? So first of all, I agree with the Catholic Church, which says that the existence of God can be known by natural reason. And I think there are several sound arguments for God's existence. I don't endorse every single argument, though I think all of them can offer various degrees of credence. So, like, maybe I'm not a huge supporter of the Kalam cosmological argument, but I think it might lend some credence to theism, even if I don't wholeheartedly defend it, because I think there's a lot of physics there that I just don't understand about time and about the beginnings of the universe. But generally, I would say that my reasons for belief are layered. So at the sort of, I don't know if it's at the foundation or where it is, but I would say that I think it's rationally defensible, right? And I think it is based on a couple of arguments that I think are the strongest for belief in God. And one of them is the ontological argument, especially the variation, the original variation, which you find in Proslogion 2. I know that some philosophers don't think that that's actually where the argument is. They think it's in Proslogion 3, but I think that's a slightly different argument and with a different conclusion. I think that Proslogion 2 is where you find a very strong argument for God's existence. And I also think that various forms of the contingency argument from Anselm to Leibniz are extremely strong reasons to believe in God. Now, those are just sort of intellectual reasons, and that's not honestly how I first came to believe in God, right? I would say that my belief really started, first I was taught to believe, right? And so I trusted my parents and I trusted my faith community. And then I've had throughout my life spiritual encounters or experiences with God. As I have a background in the charismatic movement, so there have been things that I've seen and experienced that make me feel as though God exists. And if you, of course, one can be skeptical of those experiences, but I think with something like Reformed epistemology, I can take these experiences for granted with, keeping in mind that there could be defeaters that come along and undermine the credibility of my experiences. But they were very powerful at the time. And it's sort of like they fade. And so the intellectual arguments kind of keep you steady and stable. When my faith was based mostly on affective experiences, I did notice that, sometimes I would feel very dry and almost like there is no God. Where's my faith? I don't know. But the intellectual arguments, I would say, brought stability to my personal experiences. And then above those, as sort of the kicker, I would say that one of the reasons I believe is really based on pragmatism or pragmatic philosophy, based on something like Pascal's wager or William James, and that is, there are days where I doubt my reason and I doubt my experiences, but then I say to myself, well, even if I come to doubt those things, I'm still going to go ahead and believe, and I think it's the right thing to do, because it's when I believe that these experiences are possible that I can sort of understand the world around me. I can live the sort of life that I think gives me value and meaning. I'm plugged into a community. My life is ordered in a way that makes sense. And I see great value in that. And I don't think entertaining endless skepticism would provide for that. I think there can be a point when skepticism can become vicious rather than virtuous, and it can sort of consume everything. And so I just say, well, okay, so sometimes I can go through these periods of doubt, and then I just say, well, I'm just going to continue to trust and put my faith in God, even if I doubt everything. But I'll be honest with you, Elmo. As I'm getting older, those moments of doubt are fewer and farther between. I think in my 20s, I would go through these periods of doubt. I would encounter an argument that I couldn't answer, and suddenly I would go into a panic trying to figure out a solution, right? Or I wouldn't be able to figure out how an argument actually proves God's existence, and this would really trouble me and keep me up at night. But now I've just kind of become at peace. I found recently.
So what it sounds to me though, bro, is that you're a Christian because you sort of prefer it, pragmatically and emotionally, and the intellectual reasons just make it a little more comfortable for you to go this route, because I have there are all these arguments, Leibniz arguments, Kalam, the ontological argument, and so I guess it makes it a little easier for you to swallow the pill, if you know what I mean. Is that the case?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess the swallow the pill makes it sound like it's something bitter and hard to believe, and I think about it, and I think part of the kind of hard to believe is that it's so extraordinary, in the sense that our everyday experiences can really jade us to reality. And so one thing I like to actually reflect on is the problem of induction, and how really reality, what the problem of induction really reveals to me is how surprising reality really is. That things should fall to the earth, that waves should crash in the sea, that there should be an atmosphere on Earth.
What do you mean? Like you're saying that, oh look, the universe follows these inductive processes, and therefore God.
Well, I'm not saying therefore God. I'm saying that we come to think that that's just usual, but it's actually quite strange. And
it is
so
strange,
reality
doesn't mean that there is a God, right?
No, I'm not saying that because it's strange. What I'm saying is that any way you slice it, reality is just bizarre. I think if you're an atheist, if you're a Christian, it's just extraordinary. And we can kind of just say, oh, well, our ordinary everyday experiences are normal. But that's, I think, a psychological illusion. It's really not normal. It's quite miraculous. Anyway, you look at it, because it gets down to that fundamental question.
So what you're saying is you're saying that, like, oh look, the universe is bizarre in every way, and we are just disillusioned by the normality of it, but therefore God.
No, well, I don't want to get to that therefore God yet, right? What I want to say is, all right, if you're going to say belief in God is a big pill to swallow, what I'm saying is that existence itself is a strange pill to swallow, and we kind of use the sugar of inductive experiences to say that naturalism or natural reality is ordinary. But it's actually quite strange. And I'm not sure that I actually think it's stranger to then take a naturalist route, right? So this is where you might get to God, right? You say, well, my ordinary experiences justify this belief in naturalism. Whatever that might be.
Well, nobody's saying that. I don't think anyone's saying that.
Well, I think some people do say, like, well, my ordinary experiences
maybe some
justify
people,
ordinary
but not
beliefs.
all, not naturalists.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that when you really reflect on how strange existence is, I think theism provides a sort of grounding explanation that naturalism doesn't. And so while
Yeah, but how do you know that theism actually does solve the solution, become the solution? Because like you can't demonstrate, you can't prove it. It is a hypothesis or like a model in your mind.
Well, it could be. At the end of the day, all reason can fail. And I would be left with nothing, really. I couldn't trust anything. But
so do you agree that you could also like fail at your belief in God, that God can actually not be real?
I'm fallible, so that I don't.
So that means that your knowledge of God is fallible too, that He could actually not be real.
There is I think a certain epistemic humility in granting that even with the strongest proofs, on a sort of hyper skeptical position, I could be wrong about that, and I could be wrong about the existence of you. I could be wrong about the existence of the external world and of the existence of the past. Those sorts of skeptical questions, I think we have to admit that they remain, but I also don't have to give them a high level of probability or credence. And I think it's more, a worry that you can obsess over or you can become focused on when you engage in philosophy. You can always say, well, I want to, and that's sort of the Cartesian, I think, the Cartesian temptation to have certitude. And so I think there are demonstrations or proofs for God's existence that are perfectly sound. And then you might say, well, how do you know those premises are absolutely true? And I could say, well, I can know them to the point where their denial would lead to utter skepticism, to the point where I'd basically have to check out. I'd have to check out as a...
Yeah, okay, maybe, sure. Yeah. If we all skeptics, we could actually not be like epistemological, ontological nihilists. We could be nihilists in every way. But sure. So are you saying that so we are granting that we exist? Even though we can't really prove that we exist, we're granting all this, that there are other minds. So why can't we grant that there's a God? Right?
Right. Well, and it's more than just granting, but I think that there are first principles of reason. There are sort of bedrock axioms about existence that, yes, you can always doubt. But again, I think that skepticism is a virtue. And what I mean is that there is a certain dysfunctionality or dysfunction that might come about if you take skepticism too far. And so if you ask me, is it possible to doubt? For Daniel Vecchio, it's possible. I could doubt, I could go along with Hume and even doubt that the cogito of Descartes. I can sort of wrap my mind around that, where he basically says, yeah, there are thoughts, but is there a thinker? I don't know. There are perceptions of thoughts that are happening, but are those perceptions happening to a me? I can entertain that, but I'm not.
Yeah, well, when you're a true skeptic, it's not that you're not going to believe in anything. It's just that you're going to challenge all the ideas to the point of asking for like proper, valid arguments and justification. So, a skeptic can still believe that they exist, and everything else, but they're just going to admit to themselves that they can't arrive at a proper reasoning for all of this,
Well, that's what I think, where I'm sort of coming at it from almost like an ethical standpoint when we talk about what's proper, right?
I don't think it's ethical. I don't think proper justification is about ethics. I think it's just about following logic.
So here I would disagree. I think that actually epistemology, when it's talking about how we ought to believe and how we ought to reason and how we ought to take evidence, I think there is an element.
I don't think epistemology is talking about anything odd. It's just talking about knowing.
Right, but what I'm saying is that knowing is normative. It gives us rules for when we can be justified or warranted in a belief, and I think there is an ethical dimension to that. I do think that, and that's why.
Okay, let's talk about what do you mean by ethics in terms of knowing? So are you saying like it's wrong for me to know this and not know this? What do you mean?
Well, no. What I mean is that. There are conditions maybe where you are not fulfilling your epistemic duties, and you might say that you're doing the wrong thing, right?
Who says it's wrong?
Well, again, this goes into a broader picture, right? It goes into the broader picture of what our function
of presupposing God.
Well, it doesn't presuppose God, but maybe it at least starts with the question of what am I and what does it mean for me to live well, and so then.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like if you're not going to presuppose God in this ethical epistemological journey, so how would you arrive from just pure epistemology to actually having an ethical standpoint on epistemology?
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer for that. Again, my cheat in all of this is to fall back on a sort of pragmatism, which is this sort of question,
so
does it work?
So it's just pragmatic. It just works for you.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Is this allowing me to live my life? And I think that there are certain worldviews that are not really livable. I meet people who claim to be mereological nihilists or moral nihilists or something like that, and they espouse a belief. Or
I think people can live that way.
What's that?
I think people can live that way if they want to. What do you mean by like not applicable worldviews? I'm confused.
Well, I don't think some of these worldviews are really livable. I think that they have to perform contradictions. And they might be able to endlessly justify it, but I think it becomes ad hoc after a while to kind of salvage their commitments. So, you can't refer to tables and chairs, or I refer to tables and chairs out of convenience. Things like that.
Okay, so are you saying that like, let's say, like, what you just said, like not moral nihilism is not livable because if someone lives it, they're going to inevitably face like internal contradictions, right, and inconsistency. So that's why it's not livable.
Yeah, it's not livable because we fundamentally, as humans, we value, and we place values on things. So to say, well, values aren't real, and I really want to believe.
Well, that's because they're moral nihilists. So
right. Well, again, this gets back to the epistemology question, whether that's moral. I think that moral nihilists want to believe the truth, and they value the truth, and they think it's right to believe the truth. And so their view is, well, there are no moral values, and
I wouldn't say like moral nihilists care about the truth. They just like came about the truth and just accept it. I don't think they ought to actually believe they ought to believe in the truth in any way.
well, then again, if they didn't really value it, if they didn't really have a commitment to it, then I think the belief would be very unstable for them. It would just sort of, well, oh, I've stumbled on the truth, but why stay on it? I mean, it's just an accident that I happen to adhere to this and actually complicate my life as a moral nihilist. I think it does involve some complications. It's probably involves,
Yeah, and that's why there are existential philosophies that arise like after nihilism, right? Like absurdism and the like.
Right. And I think that's working through those sorts of contradictions, and they sort of embrace the absurdity of it all. And I think that, it's sort of, to me, that reveals what we call in philosophy the reductio, right? The reduction to the absurd. And the interesting thing is you don't go back and revise the hypothesis that led you there. Why not? Why not go back and say, well, maybe my fundamental ontology, my fundamental axiology, my fundamental views of ethics led me to this place where reality isn't just strange, but actually doesn't make sense in some fundamental level. Well, I'd go back and say, well, maybe there's a problem at my foundations or my first principles.
So you're saying that, like your worldview is inconsistent, has problems with its foundations, so it's not livable. So are you saying that your worldview does not have problems and internal contradictions and it is livable?
I'm not saying that my worldview is free of difficulties.
But it has no problems with the foundations and everything else, like contradictions.
Well, I have faith that, I guess I would say I have faith in it, right? So, and I am open to the possibility. In other words, if someone comes along and says, here are some massive problems with your worldview, I'm not the type of person that's going to take some cotton balls and shove them in my ears. I'd want to work it out. And that's what I'm talking about. If I do have a massive contradiction in my worldview, then I really think I ought to iron it out. And that's different than what I was talking about earlier, which is sort of living in this sort of skeptical, there might be contradictions in my system. So unless I know that there are no contradictions, I can't, I can't be certain. So I should just doubt it. I'm saying, look, I'm just going to go ahead and believe and live as billions of people have, who've lived good and happy, meaningful lives. And I'll be content with that. And yes, I do value the truth, and I value inquiry. I value skeptical objections. I value defeaters, and I want to know. But I don't think I have to suspend judgment. That's a point I take from William James, where he basically says there's sort of these two attitudes, right? You can, and again, this goes back to this sort of normativity of epistemology that I was talking about, which is we can have this sort of law that we adhere to, which is avoid error. We avoid false beliefs at all cost. Or we could have and that, he says, is distinct from a principle that says believe what is true. If your only rule is avoid error, there's a very simple remedy, which is to be a global skeptic. Don't believe anything, and you will avoid error. But I don't think it's livable, and I think you're going to miss a lot of opportunities to know things. I think we also have a principle to know truth. Now, those two principles together put us in a tight situation, because now we have to figure out what's true from what's false. It's not the simple the simple task of just doubting everything. Remember, Descartes doubted to know, and he wanted truth. So I think you need both principles operating, and so yeah, I believe. I think it's worth believing in Christianity, and I believe in the Catholic Church. I affirm it's true. And when people bring up objections, I do wonder about it. I think about it. It doesn't necessarily collapse my worldview. What I have found is that many times people raise objections, and maybe I can't answer it right away, or other people answer it, and I say, "Oh, that's a good answer." Maybe there's some things I can't ever answer adequately, and I just have to weigh, well, how critical is that to my whole worldview? How is it vital that this be resolved in my lifetime in order for me to believe? And sometimes I don't think it's at the center or core, and I'll just continue to believe.
Okay, I see your where you stand, bro. Okay, okay. So then I guess this talks about more of just your view on theism, right, and why you hold it in comparison to other views. But why the Catholic Church? Because just because you're a theist or a Christian doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a Catholic. So why do you think the Catholic Church has the right theology?
That's a hard thing to wrap around, and I do think about this all the time. Yeah, we got time. Okay, so I would begin first with this fundamental experience that I have with the Catholic Church, which is that the sacraments are a channel of grace. I feel forgiven when I go to confession. I recognize God's presence in the Eucharist. So that's one thing, sort of my personal experiences again. It's very personal to me, so it might not convince another person, right? But I would say this, look, to me, coming out of the confessional and feeling forgiven is one of the most profound experiences of God's grace that I have had. And so there must be something going on there. And so that sort of separates out. I know that other Christian denominations might have a sacrament of confession. I mean, maybe the Orthodox or some high church Anglicans or something. I'm not too familiar with that. But that at least tells me that there's something going on in the confessional, and there's something going on with the priest. And so that's just sort of a personal reason, right? The second is the theology, right? And here I don't want to offend other Christians necessarily. That I'm not trying to personally attack anything here, but I do find among Protestants that their doctrine of God and their doctrine of the Trinity can not necessarily be deficient, but allows for deficiencies in such a way that one can still remain in communion with their denomination and hold to positions like neoclassical theism, where God enters time, where God is mutable, where God has passive potencies, where God has emotions, and it sort of allows for anthropomorphisms. I don't see that there's a strong attempt to hold the line on that. I think, you see that among the top scholars in the evangelical circles right now, and they entertain a lot of positions that I would consider deficient theologically. I think that that we can reason about God in a way that I think leads to divine simplicity. And so among the churches, the Christian churches that really hold to it in a strong way, I think it's the Catholic Church. I think the Orthodox Church, I have some problems with the Palamite derivations of these things. The energies and essence distinction I really struggle with for me. And So while I don't want to outright condemn it or anything like that, I can't reconcile it in my mind. So if I have a sort of rational commitment to divine simplicity that would prevent me, I think, from entertaining the theology of the Orthodox Church and the sort of allowance within Protestant circles to deviate in their doctrine of God without correction, without excommunication, without anything like that. It's just sort of like, well, maybe we have a not necessarily a creedal, but a confessional commitment to these things, but we don't really, hold people to it necessarily in a rigid way. So you'll see some theologians express social Trinitarianism, which I think is also a deficient view of the Trinity. I just would prefer to find myself in a church that holds the line to sort of the classical formulations of the creeds of these doctrines, as I think that there's been some good reason behind them. And I think these alternatives that are cropping up are a sign that that there's not a magisterial protection on these other churches to keep them from avoiding error. Does that sound really critical of me?
Yeah, I guess so. And so why do you think that the divine simplicity is something that is like an attribute of God that has to be, attributed to God, and not like in Eastern Orthodox churches that don't identify with it?
Well, I think that's the other thing. I have a hard time understanding what the Eastern Orthodox Christians are committed to, because I find very, very many different things. And I talk to different Orthodox theologians and philosophers, and they'll say different things. So I have a hard time pinning down. Whereas, one nice thing about the Catholic Church is, you can sort of just figure out what the commitment is, and that settles it. And you either accept it or you don't. So I'm not going to pin myself on what I think the Orthodox Church says, but what I would say is my reasons for divine simplicity really go back to those arguments for the existence of God, where you have to get to something that is fundamental. And I think once you introduce complexity in God, you're saying that what you hold to be God is not the fundamental thing of reality. There's something that has to explain the composition of God.
Wait, so are you saying that just if God is complex, that means he can't be the fundamental thing, or he can't produce or be the fundamental thing in the universe?
Well, I would put it this way. Either such a God is not fundamental, or such a God has some brute fact about it that
can you define fundamental? What do you mean by fundamental?
What do I mean by I'm sorry, what was the context in which I said it? So,
like, what do you mean by God to be the fundamental thing in the universe?
What I mean is the ultimate explanation, the grounding of all of everything else. So
grounding on what? So
God being sort of, for me, I think these arguments get you back to the idea of God as being itself. And if you say, well, such a thing is composed of metaphysical or physical parts, then the question naturally arises, well, why should those parts be such as they are and not other parts and not in other ways? And you either say, well, there is an explanation for that, in which case there's something ontologically prior to God, or you say there is no further explanation, in which such a God is in some way inexplicable in principle, not necessarily inexplicable for me, but in principle, there would be something inexplicable about such a God. And since I think God has to be perfectly intelligible to God, I think such a God could never be fully intelligible to itself. And so I have a real fundamental problem with sort of these rejections of divine simplicity. as I think, again, it's going to introduce something that has to be explained, or you just throw up your hands and say, in principle, such a God is sort of brute, as I said. It doesn't have, it's not, there is nothing further, but not in a way that's satisfying. So all things being equal, I'd prefer the theory of God that says that God isn't unintelligible.
So wait, so I'm confused. So does it all come down to your preference then?
Well, in this case, so I'm considering different theories of God, right? And, we've got one that says God is somehow brute or inexplicable, or there's something more fundamental than God. Or there's one that says that God is perfectly self-explanatory and complete. And since I think the arguments for God get you to something supremely perfect and absolutely complete, I have to say that theory of God matches with the arguments that I have. So when I say my preference, I mean all things considered, my inclination is to think that divine simplicity follows from several of the arguments for God's existence that I endorse. And it would be, I might have to give up the arguments that I think work in order to embrace a complex God, if that makes sense. Because you get to, so for example, like a Neoplatonic proof that I think gets you to some fundamental principle that is absolutely simple, I think that's a way to God, right? And if you say, well, actually God's complex, then I'd have to say, oh, well, this fundamental principle that I arrived at, that's actually somehow grounding the existence of God. So God isn't being itself. God is a derivative of this principle. It would be like saying in Neoplatonic language, what we call God is an emanation from the one. Well, if so, the heck with God, I want to talk about the one.
So in this sense though, right, like how could you make blend ADS with the Trinity?
Well, I think the language of the Trinity grew up with divine simplicity, right? So the theologians and church fathers who developed divine simplicity and developed the doctrine of the Trinity did so with divine simplicity in mind. So I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that that the language of the Trinity can be confusing and taken in ways that imply parts, that God is somehow divided into three parts or something like that. And again, I think this leads...
I guess the Trinity, okay, let's talk about this. Like the Trinity says that God is one God in three persons, right? So three persons means that there is that one person is not identical to the other person, right? And the Holy Spirit is not identical to the Son and not identical to the Father, right? So there is this, I guess this...
Well, I think that's a little bit of a... And maybe this is where maybe some other people might disagree with me. I wouldn't say that the Father and the Son are not identical. What I would say is they are not the same person. I think they are identical. The Father is the same God as the Son, right? So they're to reduce the discussion to numerical identity, I think is misguided when it comes to the Trinity.
Well, I guess what I mean by identical is like exactly, the same. Because, like, for example, if you were to say that the Father and the Son are identical, it's like saying like the Father is identical to the Father, and so there would be actually no absolute difference between the Son and the Father, but as persons, there is a difference, right?
They're different persons.
Yes, so
they're not different gods.
So how would you say that there's a difference if in God, if he is like absolutely divinely simple? that there is no, in fact, like all parts is identical?
Well, that's what I think the Church Fathers meant by saying that the Father and Son are consubstantial, right? And the Holy Spirit, that they are one substance. They're the same substance. So the same divine nature. It's not similar. It's not different instances of the same substance. They are the same substance. So I think, and again, this is where we're getting to the absolute limits of what I can reason about, and the Trinity is beyond that. So what I would say is more apophatic, and in the sense that I do not think we can say things like we can't apply absolute identity and Leibnizian rules around identity to the Trinity and God. There might be something about identity that is, there are conditions under which identity rules are suspended, and I'm comfortable with that. There are contexts in which identities exist or sameness exists, but do not admit of substitution, one for another. So we find examples of this in philosophy, and I think that's sufficient to just, for me, to rest on it and just say, well, this is just a context in which you can say they are the same God, but not the same person. And when it comes to contradictions, that sort of qualification would prevent it from being a direct contradiction, because the identity or the sameness is not meant in the same way. It's not meant in the same.
But if you have this standard for you believing the Catholic traditions, right, and theology, why not say the same for accepting Protestant or Eastern Orthodox theology with this same approach?
Well, I that's not typically how it's cashed out, in terms of sort of saying, well, when we're talking about other theological traditions that are making positive claims, right, that say, well, God is three distinct centers of consciousness. God has three wills, three intellects, things like that. I think they're making very positive and univocal claims about the nature of God. So when I say, well, this is at the limit of what I can know, but I know that, I know that identity doesn't have to be taken as absolute numerical identity, and it can still be true. And we can make qualifications that admit of distinctions without introducing complexity. And for me, that is probably one of the areas that I'm very much interested right now in exploring. And so again, yes, if I were to find an obvious contradiction that is irresolvable and just I have to be committed to, that would probably be a defeater for my Catholic views about the Trinity. But again, I'm not sure then I would roll back into something like a social Trinitarian view, because my commitments to divine simplicity, I might roll into something completely else, some other direction from there, right? So it might force me into a Unitarian perspective of God. This is why I often dialogue with Unitarians, and I tell them that if I were not a Catholic, I might be a Unitarian.
Okay, one last question, man, because it's awesome talking to you, and we're almost at an hour. And you're a Catholic, right? And also, I guess we're all Christian, and I guess some of the audience. I guess I want to ask you, like, as a Christian, how would you, convince discuss theology with other Christians who don't believe the same way that you do in terms of tradition and theology?
Well, I'm always praying with and dialoguing with other Christians. I have some Facebook groups that I facilitate, and we have Orthodox and we have Protestant friends, and we have a lot of commonality, shared interests. I believe they're Christians. I believe their baptisms are valid. And I hope for their salvation. I think that if and when they're saved, they'll realize that they've always been a member of the one church, right? But maybe they didn't realize it at the time. And I think there's things like invincible ignorance, conditions that we find ourselves in this day and age can be an impediment for some people to come to the truth. So that's the good thing is I don't have to make those sorts of judgments. God does, right? So I'll let God ultimately decide who's right and who was not culpable for their wrongness. And in the meantime, I don't try to be mealy-mouthed or compromise in what I believe. But I do try to emphasize when I'm in an ecumenical context, our shared commonalities. What I mean is, if I'm challenged on something, or if I detect that my Protestant or Orthodox friend is trying to make a point of theological difference where I disagree, I'm not going to back down and say, well, you're right, or for the sake of unity. I still have to stand up for what I believe. But I think that there's enough shared commonality, especially when it comes to culture, when it comes to discussions with non-Christians, that we can really support one another. And I'm happy to do so. And I love my Christian brothers and sisters. So.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, bro. I wish that we had more time, and maybe you could come on another episode sometime. And yeah, thank you so much, man. Okay. So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
It used to be hard to find the exact auto parts you needed, and that meant spending a lot of time at swap meets. It's a different game now when you can order exactly what you need from eBay Motors. They have 122 million parts, so you can always find the right fitment. Spend less time searching and more time building with the eBay Motors app, or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.